But the silicone liners, I think, would help everybody just in your everyday life, being able to go to work, to be a parent, to drive your car, or just do whatever you do. Your prosthesis is going to feel more natural, more part of you. You're going to have less problems. And if I could do what I'm doing, you know, it's going to help every other amputee who's not an athlete, but just wants to get on with their life and get back into the routine of normal living.
My name is Wayne Koniuk. I'm here with the San Francisco Prosthetic and Orthotics Service. What we wanted to do is show you the progression of liners and how to make these liners from injection molding silicone rubbers. You're all familiar with the standard tube liners that are on the market now. There's no real anatomical shape to these. It's sort of pick the right size and you can fit that particular person. There's some popular urethane liners available that have a little bit more of an anatomical shape. You can see a little bit of a kneecap area here. And this one I'll just sort of call a custom tube. What we've done here is we were able to custom make and custom injection mold silicone liners for specific individuals. This one here is a standard silicone liner that we make. The things that make these unique are one of the anatomical shapes that are developed in the liner itself. We're also able to selectively thicken the silicone in areas where you need to have that pressure relief. We're going to add an extra 3 millimeters of silicone down the crest of the tibia and an extra 3 millimeters of silicone over the fibula head. We've also added 10 millimeters worth of thickness of silicone on the distal end. The rest of this liner is a thin 5 millimeter profile. We've taken that one step further just recently by selectively injecting silicones of different durometers inside these liners. So now we have a true multi-durometer liner. Again, we have the same anatomical shaping. The blue silicone is 5 millimeters thick, and it's a durometer of 20, which is a relatively hard silicone. Down the crest of the tibia and the fibula head in this example, we've used a 10 durometer silicone, which is quite a bit softer, and we've thickened that up to 8 millimeters in these prominent areas. We will also show later on in the video how to go about incorporating a distal umbrella for those who wish to use this type of system to attach to the prosthesis. In order to start the process of making the silicone liner, what we're going to do in typical fashion, you're going to make a cast of the patient. You're going to modify that cast however you feel necessary. You can even fit a test socket at that point if you want. But once all that stuff's done, we now have the modified patient model. The next thing we're going to do here is we're going to make a P-Lite liner or a P-Lite thickness profile over this model. Once we've got the P-Light thickness profile or liner done over this patient model, it's necessary to go ahead and add whatever you want as far as the thickness of the silicone. So again, in this example, we have a 5 millimeter P-Light thickness. We've added an extra 3 millimeters of P-Light down the crest of the tibia and on the head of the fibula. So these things are outlined, this extra 3 millimeters outlined with the black lines right now. This liner at this point will then be removed from the patient model. This will be saved for laminating later on. We're going to reinforce this with a couple of thin layers of plaster of Paris bandage, and we're going to create an extension about 4.5 inches longer than the model. You'll see later on when it comes time to actually form the plastic, some of this extra plaster down here will act for the mold to key into the model so the inside piece doesn't wiggle around inside the model itself. So I'll go ahead and measure up some plastic here, some plaster bandage. There are times when instead of using a P-Light for a thickness profile, we may be using an old urethane liner that's halfway worn out. When you have a very flexible liner like that, we want to reinforce the outside of this so when it's filled with plaster, it doesn't blow up like a balloon. We'll just lay these strips on here one at a time until we get good coverage without trying to distort the liner in any way, shape, or form. Remember when you're doing this, you want this plaster to be about 4 inches longer than the actual profile itself. Okay, so we're just going to make this plaster, make sure this plaster is all smooth together and that all the pieces are actually sticking to each other. The other thing you might want to do at this point is try to make these walls or these extensions as smooth as possible. That's going to save you a little time later on in model preparation if you make these nice and smooth. It's been a couple of minutes here and this plaster is now pretty hard. This will definitely maintain the shape of this mold when we fill it up with plaster. I'm going to trim it down just to clean it up a little bit here before we fill it. Remember, we want to have at least a couple of inches up there, and that'll make a lot of sense once you see how the molds are formed and how the molds key into place so that things don't move around too much. We've got a little bucket of sand here that we can kind of balance things up in a little bit so it doesn't flop over on the table. So the P-Light liner is inside of the thickness profile. We've got our extension, our 4 inches above the P-Light. We'll just set it up in a stand here. Okay. Put the pipe in, measure it, keep it up about 3/4 inch off the bottom of the model itself. In order to secure the pipe in there and keep it off the bottom, we've made a little plastic holder. We'll set the pipe all the way at the bottom, have the holder put in place, and then lift it up so we get that 1/2 inch of space down the bottom. You just don't want that pipe sticking right through the end of the plaster. I'm just going to pour a little bit of baby powder in here to make this a little easier to remove later on. So just a little bit in there will be fine. One of the things that save you a lot of time later on when you mix your plaster, if you don't introduce a lot of bubbles while you're mixing it. I'm just going to pour off very carefully the excess water that's left over. And this is ready now for mixing. So again, we don't want to whip this. We want to mix it fairly slowly so that we don't introduce a lot of air into this whole plaster mix here. We're going to fill this just about up to the top of our little extension there. Little vibrating just to bring the bubbles to the top. Our plaster that we filled this with is now hardened up. We'll start to strip this off. And when you do this, you want to be careful not to really, don't get a knife on there, don't try to cut through anything when you're taking it off. But this will remove fairly easily from the profile we just made. So we've got here our profile and the plaster inside, which will become the inside of this mold. So we'll just take the kind of humps and bumps off it, again being careful not to really touch the model too much. So we'll sand that down a little bit here. We just want to smooth things up a little bit. The other thing I'm doing when I'm doing this, I'm thinking about where the seam of that mold's going to be and how the mold's actually going to be removed from the cast. So, for example, we're going to put this seam down the inside here, or the outside of the leg here, and then down the inside. So this is where we're going to look as where the two pieces are going to seam together. This is going to angle away from that seam line this direction. The bottom piece is going to angle away from the seam line that direction. Again, thinking about this as the highest point where the seam line is going to be, everything has to be pulled off without getting stuck into the plastic. So I'm going to make sure that I expose all the thickness profile we had there and just smooth this off. This area doesn't have to be real super smooth. You just want to get the high parts cut off it a little bit. The other thing we're going to do here is to keep, when we form these two pieces on here, we want to have some kind of registration marks in here so the mold goes back together the same way each and every time. There's a couple ways to do that. One way is just to take a fairly large size drill and make some dimples in the mold here. You can do one or two on each side. Again, when you're doing this, you're going to think that these two pieces are going to come apart in this fashion, so we don't want to put these little dimples on the sides or the plastic will actually get stuck into them. So we'll put a couple dimples on one side, flip it over, and put a couple dimples on this side also. This will help all those pieces go back together in the exact same place. When we get ready to form this thermoplastic shell on top of this, we want to be able to draw some vacuum down at the end of these holes, so it pulls the plastic firmly into the holes. So we just got a little drill made out of a coat hanger here. We're just going to punch some holes through those registration marks. Another way you could register that mold in is by taking a half-round file if you wanted and just scrape some kind of a line in the top there. Again, this will just help when those pieces go back together. You're going to see that they're going to key into all these different areas. You don't have to use both of these techniques. One or the other would work fine. This piece of Vivac is going to be sandwiched on here, so when you're taking the measurements, we want to make sure that we have enough to form, a couple inches worth of plastic on both sides of this. All right, our plastic is cooled off from our vacuum forming there in the oven. We're going to get ready to drill holes in this mold, so once it's separated, we have some way to bolt it back together and hold it onto our model. You want to try to remember that all these holes should be drilled, the distal alignment pin and the holes on the sides to hold the mold together, before you take it apart for the first time. Once you've taken this mold apart, if you forgot to drill your holes and you try to put it back together, you'll never get it back on correctly. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to drill a distal alignment pinhole. And that's done, especially if you have a real long model, to try to prevent the bottom of this model from shifting around inside the mold. Imagine now, we've only got a 5 millimeter profile down here. If that inside model moves just a quarter of an inch or an eighth of an inch, we're going to have one side very thin and one side very thick. This pin will now key the bottom of that mold into place. The next thing we're going to do is drill a couple of holes for our screws that'll actually hold this together. Okay, those holes are all drilled. The next step here is to go ahead and cut off all the excess plaster. So find your holes and just leave about a half an inch. We'll go to the bandsaw and we'll cut off all this excess material. We're also going to take here and cut the top of the mold off right here so it can be removed. Got the mold all trimmed up now. We're ready to open it up. Now is when you can remove the paper that acted as a separator for these two pieces of mold halves. Let's go ahead and pull off our thickness profile here and see what we got underneath there. So there's our model. If there's any bubbles in the model, this would be the time to go back and correct them. You see I've got a few on the bottom here. I've got some little bubbles up here and some down around the bottom. Those that all need to be filled with plaster slurry, otherwise the silicone is going to get in and leave little bumps on the inside of the liner. All right, I'm just going to smooth up this edge here to try to get rid of this little ridge that's left from the plaster there. So we'll just give that a real quick smooth, just enough to knock this sharp edge off. I'm just going to smooth this off a little bit. Okay, and while you're filling up these little holes here, make sure you don't fill up your distal alignment pin. That's not one you do want to fill up. So any little holes we might find. If there's any little teeny tiny holes that you can barely see, once we put any kind of parting agent on this, that's also going to help fill up those holes, so we don't worry about those too much. This will have to sit for just a second before we can sand it down with the screen, and then we got a nice smooth model to work with. Is we have to think somewhere we have to get silicone into this mold, we have to get silicone back out again. So one of the things we think about is finding the highest point on the model, and here we're going to create some vent holes. So once this silicone fills from the bottom up, when it reaches the very top of this point, this is where we're going to be able to vent silicone out of the top. If you put the vent down here at a low point, you're liable to catch some air bubbles up in here. So we're going to do it from there up. We have a little half-round piece of tubing we use to create those little vents. We just use a little half-round piece of copper tubing just to vent from the very top part up. Doesn't have to be a real big vent, but you want some way for some excess silicone to get out of there. Another reason for this is if something happens and you have a little bit of leakage, what's going to happen is this area is going to act as a reservoir. It's going to hold silicone up in that reservoir. So if something leaks out of the bottom or leaks from the sides, it'll draw silicone back in from that reservoir to keep this mold full and not have any void places. So I'll usually do a little vent here and then widen it up towards the top to actually act as a little reservoir for the silicone, a little pocket of silicone to sit up in that top of that reservoir. We'll do both sides. Sometimes with real complex molds, you'll find you're doing a number of vent holes in different areas, just trying to think about where the silicone is going to travel and where it might get stuck in the mold, where air might get stuck in the mold. So again, just a little vent there, just enough to let this air travel out of the top of the mold and to reservoir a little bit of silicone up there in case we have any leakage. We've got our vent holes that are going to let the silicone flow out of here. Once this, you can imagine the silicone is going to flow from the bottom, come up and come out of the vent holes. The plaster is drying where we filled the holes. We'll polish it off in a minute. What we need to do now is we need to take another look at this mold and decide whereabouts do we actually want to inject the silicone. We usually try to pick a place that's very distal, but easy to access with the injection gun. So we'll pick something down in the distal end of the tibia here. We've got our distal pin placement in the back. We'll put the hole in the front there. We're going to put our injection hole right down on the very bottom here. Anything we sand off this, if we sand too much off, we're going to make the silicone product thicker in that area. So you've got to be fairly careful with your sanding not to overdo it, but just make sure everything's nice and smooth. Yeah, there's a couple little holes there, and we're going to let the wax fill in those holes. Okay, now we have a smooth model. We're ready to prepare the shell itself. We'll place that distal pin in first. That's now secured this mold on there, so it doesn't wiggle back and forth anymore. Gotcha. Let's put this back together. Start running some screws in there to hold the whole thing together. We're going to get ready to inject silicone in this prepared mold. And for the purpose of this demonstration, what we've done is we've colored the silicone blue. That'll give you a little better contrast. You'll be able to see how the silicone fills from the bottom to the top. So these cartridges are all pre-packed. We'll break the top off just to provide the opening. We have these mix and dispense nozzles, and that's going to go ahead and meter this stuff, mix it and dispense it at the same time, so you don't have to bother with any sort of mixing or de-airing or any of those sorts of things. This tube is going to go into a pneumatic injection gun. However, for those of you who would desire, you can go ahead and do this by hand. We also have a handgun available that you can just squeeze the trigger and do it that way. You'll see this is a much quicker way to go here. I'm going to go ahead and vent just a tiny bit of this out of the top of the tube. The very first little bit of silicone that comes out there won't be mixed, so I'm going to go ahead and just let a little bit into the top of this before I start the injection. Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and start to inject the silicone into the mold. We have our plug ready to, pretty much ready to plug it in there once it's full. You just watch it fill up. If in the process of injecting this you do see a bubble enter any place, you'll see it start to float up. Most of these bubbles will be chased to the top by the pressure of the gun. If there's one in the bottom, you can always go through here and drill a little tiny hole, let that air bubble vent out, and then just close it off with a piece of clay. Don't let a bubble scare you. You can get that taken care of very easy if you see one. We want to let this mold fill all the way up and then actually up into the vents, leaving that little bit of reservoir on the very top. Well, we've shot this thing. This silicone sets up in about 2.5 hours. You can see it's pretty much ready to go here. We'll go ahead and take the screws out and remove this mold. We don't want to forget, before we pull the halves of this mold apart, let's go ahead and pull this registration pin out of there. And now we'll go ahead and start to separate the two halves of the mold here. It goes a little bit slow. You can start to see as this is pulling apart here, you can start to see the silicone release from the mold. And just go ahead and do that real slowly until you see it completely come apart. The silicone's pretty tough, so you don't have to worry too much about ripping these things, but you do want to be a little on the careful side. There's the front half of the mold. There's the back half removed there. And you can see from here, we've got, the one thing we really need to trim is this little bit of flashing that occurs from the pressure of the silicone squirting up between those two mold halves. Okay, there we go. There's our finished model. Now we've got our 5mm thickness here. Remember, we've added an extra 3mm profile down the crest of the tibia and the fibula head. So we've got 8mm on the fibula head and 8mm down the crest of the tibia.
Liners, the silicone injection liners, it was worlds different. They were molded to, my actual limb. I had no skin irritation, and I was able to get right into running, triathlon, all the activities I did before with virtually no problems at all. It's so durable that the sand and the water and the salt and the grit and the heat and the cold, everything combined. You'd think that there would be something that went wrong, but it was really just pretty much flawless. I was very happy with it. I'm assuming that everything is fine with my socket and my liner because things have been so problem-free, with the shock absorption and the fit and the skin. Everything is just, so good. And I think it's the best compliment to say that I don't even think about it.
We've already taken off the plastic shells. We've done a quick trim with the flashing. Now what we're going to do is we want to provide a soft spot in this 8 millimeter extra silicone we put here. So we're actually going to go through there, we're going to cut this out, and then we're going to reapply the mold and selectively inject that area with a softer silicone. Once we get ready to cut the silicone out, I'm going to try to do it as neatly as possible. I don't want to really hack away at this stuff. So if I can get this to cut very smoothly, we'll end up with a much nicer finished product. Also, when I'm cutting here, I'm going to try not to dig too deeply into the plaster as I'm cutting. That's going to leave a little line that we'd have to clean up later on. So I'm going to go ahead and begin to cut this as carefully as I can. And again, I'm following the 8 millimeters thickness area that we added to this mold here. And at this point, you could design any shape you wanted. If you wanted to put the soft distal end and cut the whole bottom of this out as the last liner we showed, you could do that. If you wanted to add a soft spot to the head of the fibula or any other bony prominent area or any scarred area, this would be the stage you would just cut the silicone away from those areas, and we'll fill it up with some softer silicone. Okay, I'm going to try to be very careful when I'm doing this because, again, I don't want to dig so deep that I'm actually scarring that cast underneath. Right there, we just removed our 8 millimeter thick silicone from down the crest of the tibia. Now again, what we need to think about at this stage is we're going to inject silicone in from the bottom of this void, and we need to have a couple little air vent holes at the very top. Some place for the silicone to go in, some place for the silicone to come out again. In order to do that, I'm going to spray just a little bit of alcohol on the inside of this mold. And that's going to help this slip back on that silicone a little bit easier. We'll start off by just slipping this front piece back in place. We've got our registration mark so we know exactly where it goes. The reason for this is I want to know exactly the spot where I want my silicone to be injected. I want you to think about what's going to happen here. We have to have a place for the silicone to enter, and we need to have a place for the silicone to exit, or for the air to exit. So we'll take the very bottom of this cutout, and we're going to make a mark there. This is where our silicones are going to go in. It's going to start to fill this area. We want to have a couple little vent holes right at the very top so that the silicone has some place to exit and the air has some place to exit. What we'll do is we'll build a little reservoir up here to contain some extra silicone in case we have any leakage occurs. So now we're going to put this mold back together. We're going to drill these holes and then begin that process of injecting the silicone. I'm also at this point going to drill my little vent holes at the very top of that area. I've marked 3 of them. I'll drill all 3 right now. At this point, you just want to make sure everything's real nice and clean so we don't have any of these little pieces of plastic that from the drill get stuck in our new silicone mold. Clean it up, blow it off with a little bit of air, wipe it with a rag. And we'll go ahead and put this mold back together. I'm going to spray a little alcohol right here on the inside of this mold, and that's going to help this slip back on that silicone a little bit easier. And we'll slip it back in place. I'll do the same thing with the back half, a little bit of spray there. And we're going to slide it back on the silicone. We'll bolt things together and we're ready to inject. It won't be necessary at this point to reapply the distal pin, since this mold is now held in place by the inner silicone, so we won't bother putting that pin back in this time. We've got our mold completely screwed back together. Again, we'll take a look at this just as a review. We've cut away the 8mm buildup that we put on there. We've cut the 20 silicone away from that. We've got a hole where the silicone is going to inject in. We've got a couple of vents where it's going to inject, where it's going to come back out, where it's going to vent out. So let's go ahead and put this back in our holder here. The next thing we're going to do, just like the vents and the reservoirs that we built on top of the mold so that that silicone could come up and flow up into a little reservoir, we're going to do the same thing off these holes here. And what we're going to do is just going to build a little dam out of some clay. And the idea is to let that silicone completely fill this void, start to vent out these holes, and actually create a little puddle of silicone right around those holes. We're going to build a little clay reservoir here so that as the silicone starts to vent out of our holes, we're going to create a little puddle or a little reservoir of silicone at the very top of this mold. If something happens and we leak a little bit of silicone someplace, possibly when we pull the gun out and start to put the plug in, if any silicone leaks out of this hole, it'll refill itself from what we've got as a reservoir up on top here. So we're ready to go ahead and put the silicone in here. Now again, for purpose of this demonstration, we're going to use colored silicone. This would normally be a very soft silicone, about a 10 durometer. We've added the color just so you can watch how it flows from the bottom to the top and fills the reservoir here. Normally this silicone would be clear. As we start to get to the very top here, again, this is not a time when we want to create a huge amount of pressure. We don't want to spread that silicone out too far into the other areas. We just want it to fill up this void that we've created. Now that our silicone is completely cured, we're going to go ahead and just remove the little reservoir here. Being careful not to rip the silicone, but to cut through the silicone where it comes out through out of those holes. So I'm just going to cut that silicone with my knife to release this reservoir. Okay, there's the reservoir has been released. You can see that the silicone's still in the holes. Let's go ahead and take out our plug at the bottom here. And we'll go ahead and separate the halves of these molds and we'll take a look at our product. Now we've got all our screws out of the mold now. Let's go ahead and disassemble it. We're taking the back off here first, not for any particular reason. That's what's coming off the easiest right now. And then we'll very carefully and slowly remove the front. We don't want to disturb this too much, so we'll just take it easy here when we're taking this off. There we go. That extra piece we put on there is just starting to release now. You might be able to see the change in the color on the plastic here as the silicone is actually releasing from the mold. I'm going to do this real slowly. There we go. What we can see here is a little bit left over from where the silicone went in. A little bit left over where the silicone came out, the little vent holes. We'll eventually just trim those off. But let's take this off and see what it looks like. There's our dual durometer liner. We have a 20 durometer, 5 millimeters thick, represented by the blue silicone. We have 8 millimeters of thickness with a durometer of 10 down the crest of the tibia. And like I said, we could add these soft spots anywhere necessary on the liner itself. Have a look at the inside here. What we'd like to do is go over sort of quickly the procedure involved in getting this distal umbrella embedded into the silicone liner. When considering embedding an umbrella into the distal end of a silicone liner, when we make our P-light thickness profile, one of the things we do is we add 10 millimeters of P-light on the very end. That umbrella is then mounted temporarily on the end of the liner with a little bit of contact cement, and we put another 10 millimeters of P-light to completely encase the umbrella. That's what we're looking at right here now. The umbrella's inside. We leave the pin attached. Once that umbrella and pin is embedded into the P-light thickness profile, we go ahead and vacuum form our mold over the entire thing. The next step we'll do is we'll go ahead and put a couple of slices so we can cut this umbrella out of the mold. I've removed the thickness profile from the model of the patient. I'm going to place the back half of the mold shell back on. And you can see now when we replace the pin, we've got approximately 10 millimeters of space between the residual limb and the umbrella. And we've got another 5 or 10 millimeters of space on top of the umbrella. This void will be filled with silicone, trapping the umbrella within the silicone liner. We're now going to take the distal umbrella and the pin and place it in the mold and hold it temporarily with a piece of tape. Once that's done, we can reassemble the mold, prepare it for injecting. Okay, we've just reassembled the mold. You can see that umbrella is now floating inside the mold. It's not touching the cast on the bottom. It's not touching the mold on the top. We're ready to go ahead and insert the distal alignment pin, and we're prepared to inject this with silicone. All right, it's been a couple hours now, and this material is fully cured. We just tested, make sure everything's okay. Let's go ahead and pull out the plug, get my last couple of screws out, and then we can start to disassemble this mold. As always, let's not forget to pull out this distal alignment pin before we try to separate these molds so we don't break anything on the inside. So the back half of our mold's going to come off first. We've cut away some of the flashing. Now we can go ahead and remove the pin. We've got our umbrella now trapped inside the silicone. Again, looking on the inside, you don't see the umbrella there. We don't see the umbrella from the top side here. These distal alignment holes are quickly filled with the silicone adhesive. I'm going to go ahead and just sort of dissect the end of this liner so you can see how well that pin is trapped in there. From dissecting this liner, you can now see how the umbrella has been trapped within the silicone liner.